and I'll put it into presentation mode. Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, so welcome everyone. It's a great pleasure to have the invitation to speak in the iLEAPS Global Colloquium series. And as Pallavi has said, I'm going to be talking about the role and modeling of natural methane sources. So in this talk, I'm just going to have a slide about myself, which I'll probably be very short because Pallavi's covered it. Some background information about the relevance of wetlands and permafrost thaw to the global methane and probably carbon cycles. The Jules land surface model, the representation of wetlands and permafrost, a section on evaluation, and then how we've used the Jules wetland and permafrost schemes to look at the feedbacks, the climate feedbacks, and the implications for carbon budgets. And then I conclude with a section that's around current and planned developments to Jules in this space. So I'll skip through this. As Pallavi said, I had a interest in atmospheric chemistry, air quality and air pollution, and I contributed to various national and international assessments. I joined UKCH, where I lead system modeling activities. I'm involved in the development and application of land surface and earth system models with a focus on the interactions between the land surface and atmospheric composition. I'm interested in climate land surface interactions and feedback, carbon budgets and climate mitigation, and a kind of as a separate area but linked around climate. I've also had some done some preliminary work or been involved in activities around crop modeling. So for iLEAPS, I head the International Project Office based at UKCH. I've been involved in iLEAPS and particularly with the Scientific Steering Committee since 2016. And I was on the organizing committee for the last two open science conferences. So just to kind of say why are we interested in this? So what we know is that atmospheric methane concentrations have increased from the pre-industrial period where it was around 700 parts per billion. We've seen this increase. There was an interesting phase in the early 2000s where it looked like methane concentrations in the atmosphere have stabilized, but then since then it's really taken off. Combined with the methane, those trends in atmospheric methane, what we also see is that the atmospheric methane is becoming isotopically lighter. So that means there's more of the carbon-12 isotope compared to the carbon-13. What we've also seen recently over the years is that there are significant interannual variability. We see years where the increases are driven by, these are growth rates. We can see particularly strong growth rates at high latitudes in some years. And then more recently, we've seen these kind of very strong tropical contributions, strong tropical component. What we don't really know is the kind of contribution of different sources and stinks is not completely clear. But clearly, wetlands and permafrost thaw are particularly relevant as we look at the context of anthropogenic methane and the mitigation of anthropogenic methane, which is the second most important anthropogenic greenhouse gas after carbon dioxide. And we have very strong policy commitments around things like the Global Methane Pledge, which is looking to cut anthropogenic methane by 30% by 2030. The latest assessment of the global methane budget is shown here. So what we see are in the kind of reddy orange is our anthropogenic sources, and then we see the kind of natural sources here from wetlands, and then so you see this, the width of the arrow gives an indication of the size and the importance of that source. So these are the sources. So we have fossil fuel production, we've got agriculture and waste. There's biomass burning, which is kind of both natural and anthropogenic, whether it's includes both, man-made deforestation, but also the wildfires that we see, that we recently saw in Canada. There are other natural sources, but these tend to be small. So there's inland waters, although I think there's, again, a lot of uncertainty around the size of the inland waters. So there's a range of methane sources there, and the issue is more about what's the relative contribution of these. So wetlands, together with freshwater sources, are collectively the largest natural source of methane. The major sink, the major removal of methane from the atmosphere is its chemical reaction with a hydroxyl radical. There's a couple of other minor sources like uptake by the soils. However, there's an imbalance between what are called bottom-up estimates and top-down, which is what the atmospheric concentration measurements tell us. And those can be from surface measurements that I showed earlier or from satellites. And one of the issues in terms of a bottom-up estimate of wetlands is to do with the uncertainty in the wetland extent. Looking at the, from a climate perspective, the feedbacks from wetlands and permafrost. So what we know is that work has shown that the wetland methane has a positive temperature response. So as the climate warms, we will get more methane, and there's various studies, including those by colleagues like Nick Gedney, that show how methane wetland emissions will increase with climate change, both from temperature and precipitation and to some extent carbon dioxide. What I want to quickly touch on here is permafrost. So these are frozen organic soils. They are a major reserve or store of carbon, and that is currently trapped in the frozen soil. But obviously, as permafrost thaws, as the climate warms, permafrost thaws, the soil gets warmer, and we start to get more activity. And probably up to about 3 or 4 years ago, certainly probably within the last IPCC cycle, the tendency was to assume that it's part of the carbon cycle, so permafrost is kind of largely released as carbon dioxide. But we do know that some of that carbon is actually released as methane, and because of the kind of higher radiative forcing or global warming potential of methane, that obviously has a bigger climate impact. And I just really kind of, the other aspect of the talk today is around carbon budgets. So the Paris Climate Agreement aims to limit the global temperature increase to less than 2 degrees, with an aspiration to keep it below 1.5 degrees. So we've already seen probably more than 1 degree of warming since the pre-industrial period, and with the strong El Nino phase that we're about to enter, there's obviously speculation and actually I think evidence that we may already have gone past 1.5 degrees of warming on a temporary basis, but we can see that we've already committed to a fair amount of warming. What work has previously shown is that the long-term warming is linearly related to the total emission to carbon dioxide, the cumulative emissions. And so we can use that in a sensible way of getting defining a carbon budget. So how much carbon can be emitted, and in the sense carbon includes all the greenhouse gases, how much carbon can be emitted to reach a specific temperature target. I now want to turn to modeling methane emissions from wetlands. So it's primarily caused by microbial processes in the soils. So we have methane is produced by anaerobic methanogenesis. So we have two main processes. So there are microbial microbes that can break the carbon-carbon bond in acetate, or there are other ones that can combine hydrogen with carbon dioxide. Similarly, so that's called methanogenesis, and there are methanogens. There are also microbes in the soil that can actually consume methane. This is called methanotrophy. So we have that, there's a balance there between production and loss of methane. And then the methane is transferred to the atmosphere by various processes. We have ebullition, which is to do with bubbles. We have diffusion through the soil and water, or we have plant-mediated transfer. So there are many individual processes, and you can see that they work on a wide range of scales. So to make that tractable for large-scale modeling, we have simpler, we make approximations. So we have simple schemes which would define a wetland area, information about the substrate and temperature dependence. Or alternatively, maybe in a simpler way, we could define a particular wetland type, and we associate emissions with those different wetland types. In the more complex schemes, we have multiple substrates. We take account of the wetland vegetation. We describe some of these transport processes in details. We can also take account of other processes that either inhibit or enhance the methane generation. So I'm going to focus very much on the JOULES land surface model. So JOULES is the Joint UK Land Environment Simulator. Despite the fact it has UK in the title, it actually operates on all scales from point to global. So it is the UK Community Land Surface Model. It effectively is looking at it's a process-based model that is looking at the exchange of carbon, energy and water between the atmosphere and land surface. And you'll see that we also have methane there because the wetlands are such a big source and a big contributor in terms of the climate land feedbacks. So JOULES at the moment has a wetland module and an associated methane emissions scheme that was developed by my colleague Nick Gedney. So it's using topography as a kind of key thing. So it's identifying low points in the landscape or the grid cell, and it's looking at the direction, how the topography is looking at, it's effectively using water table here. It's trying to predict for a grid square with the input water where the water table would be, and therefore how much of the grid cell is essentially saturated, and that kind of defines a wetland fraction. So this is the FW. So we have a parameterization for methane then. So the flux of methane depends on a constant. It's multiplied by a wetland fraction. There is a specification of the substrate carbon, and then this is a temperature dependent term. In terms of permafrost, JOULES includes freezing and thawing of soils, so it allows for that phase change. It's got a 14-layer soil column implemented to account for the hydrothermal and carbon dynamics, and this improves the estimate of soil carbon stocks and net ecosystem exchange. It also, the soil carbon balance includes a diffusivity term to represent cryoturbation and bioturbation processes that turn over the soil. There's a multi-layered methanogenesis scheme. So that allows an insulated subsurface layer of active methanogenesis to continue after the surface is frozen. And that's particularly important for the representation of high latitude methane emissions. And as I'll show, this gives a better description of the shoulder season behavior of the methane emissions. I'll come back to that later. So these developments have improved the description of the emissions and the release of carbon from the as methane from these deep soil layers, including permafrost. What I want to do is to really just put here some evaluation of the Jules wetland module. So this is work that I was involved with one of my colleagues, Eddie Coleman-Platt. So what he's doing here is got a range of Jules estimates of the wetland extent. This is on a global basis, and he's here comparing for the present day against a range of data sets. So there's a microwave or a merge project here based on microwave sensing and maps called SWAMPS, the Global Lakes and Wetland Database. It's a merged product, and you can kind of see the mean and the max. And then these are a number of other products, including the SWAMPS GLD that was in a publication in 2017, where again, one of the issues is that there's a significant amount of uncertainty in the observational products, and that's an active area of research. But what we're showing is that we're within the range of these products, giving us some confidence. And the figure on the right is a zonal plot showing, I think it's the maximum in the here and the mean. So we feel confident that we've got a reasonable description of the wetland distribution. We can then turn that to look at the methane. And again, we're looking at essentially here an ensemble. So the Jules data are in the red and the dark red. So these where I'm highlighting here, and these are compared against effectively the Sunwartel 2016 is also on a global methane paper. It's probably the earlier one to the Global Carbon Project figure I showed earlier. It was the data that were available at the time of this work, and what we're showing is the kind of top-down estimates and the bottom-up estimates. And again, as you could see, so this is done by different regions. So Boreal North America, the US continent, Central America, and so on, Russia, Oceania, Europe. And I think whilst, there are, I think generally it's showing that we're getting the regional description, at this kind of subcontinental scale in a reasonably way. And we're looking at three different ways of potentially specifying the wetland temperature dependencies. So that gave us some confidence, but as we know, that kind of gives probably a global picture that says at that kind of large scale we've kind of got a reasonable description. But if we focus in on specific wetlands, we will always find that there are differences and issues, and this is what this section I'm now looking at is how we've evaluated this. So this basically grew out of some work that was published in 2018 by Rob Parker that I was a co-author on, two subsequent studies followed from that. So the first again led by Rob Parker in 2020 was to look at a data-driven product called Wet Charts, and a paper that was published last year was to look at the joules. So it was a kind of similar exercise looking at joules, and we set up a global run at a 1/2 degree spatial resolution. It's effectively a factorial experiment, so it's set up as an ensemble of 24 members. So we have two representations of the driving meteorology. We've got 3 vegetation configurations. So this is things about how we define the phenology. So we have one that's based on calculating leaf level phenology, and we have 2 configurations where we've also switched on a dynamic vegetation module within joules, and we can look at that with and without competition. We chose 2 temperatures values and 2 descriptions of the wetland extent, so that's as modeled, and then one where we just essentially sample, use a version which is as modeled, but we impose a mask based on observations. So the idea is here that we're going to create an ensemble of joules wetland emissions. We're going to then compare those against satellite observations of column methane, and to do that we need to run these emissions through an atmospheric chemistry transport model, and in this case we've used the Tomcat model, and we do a separate run of the Tomcat model for each joules ensemble member. So we also have to take account of the other methane emission sources, and this is a global run that's run from 2009 to 2017. What I'm showing you here is a correlation between the different ensemble members and with the GOSAT measurements. So you can see some correlations between the different joules ensemble members. The correlation is kind of very variable against the observations, and we'll explore that in the coming slides. So these are the 24 different realizations of the wetland emissions. So you kind of see that joules puts a lot of the wetland, I would say a lot of the emission into the tropics. And then you can see as we impose a swamps mask on this, that we start to get more structure and we start to enhance, and we see more of the high latitude emissions. So as I say, we combine each joules wetland ensemble member with the non-methane. We're using the University of Leicester GOSAT proxy methane product of the column atmospheric methane, and we're running the Tomcat model, and we sample it at the time and location of the GOSAT soundings. So what I want to do here is to basically show the GOSAT here. So this is identifying regions which are away from wetlands, the influence of methane wetland emissions, and we want to just show that the non-methane wetland emissions that we're using are realistic. And so these are 3 regions where we know that there's little influence of the wetlands, and we're getting a reasonable description of the GOSAT, of the Tomcat model output with these kind of different joules ensemble. So what we've done now is to focus in on a number of tropical wetland areas. So there's 16 domains considered here. So this is then how the so in the red, we show the GOSAT data. So we're showing a time series globally and for each of those regions over that time period. And the kind of spread that you see in the in the kind of blue is the range from the joules ensemble. And you can see for some sites it's doing a reasonable job, but for other sites, we've got both issues in terms of amplitude, but also in some cases, some phase issues. So we want to explore this a little bit more. So first of all, this is to look at the correlation and the bias against the GOSAT data for the different wetlands. So you can see the correlation coefficient here. So this is having, essentially, this is correlation between the joules ensemble members and a kind of a GOSAT where we've taken out the non-wetland sources. So we're just kind of strictly comparing the wetland signal from joules and the wetland signal in the GOSAT. So we can kind of see that there's a very variable performance. Some wetlands we're getting reasonable agreements or issues in terms of correlation. Others we get good correlation with some biases. Now, just to show that the data-driven product was not perfect either. This is taken from the earlier paper, looking at the wet charts ensemble, and you can see slight, similar patterns, similar levels of performance. So we can kind of at one level say maybe this joules at that stage represents where we're at, but I will come. This next slide is a little bit more, I need to kind of explain a little bit what we've done. We're basically looking at the change in two metrics, one of which is the correlation coefficient, and the second is the standard deviation. That's some measure of spread. What we're doing here is to look at each of those drivers in the factorial. So we had the meteorological driving data, the vegetation, the temperature, and the wetland extent. And we're looking at pairs. So we're looking at the things. So if you think we have two meteorological driving factorials, we have 3 vegetation options, we've got 2 temperature options, and 2 wetland extents. So if we look at the era, what we're doing is we're looking at the era interim set, and we're looking at pairs where the phenology is the same in the 2 runs, etc. So we're trying to kind of look at some of what's causing some of these differences, whether there are particular processes in the wetlands scheme that are kind of highlight. So what we can kind of conclude from this is that the meteorological driving data seem to be very important in terms of there with some preference for the one of the meteorological. So this is the era interim. This is watch forcing data. There's no clear preference on the vegetation. It looks like the lower temperature response performs marginally better. And we don't really see in this sense that the using swamps as a kind of mask makes a great deal of difference. So that's it kind of pointed to things, but we kind of now knew from the kind of earlier work that there were perhaps processes that were missing from joules. So probably that was kind of looking at these things. So I'm going to focus in on some of the wetlands areas that have particular challenges. So if I look at the Sud wetland in South Sudan, this would be the joules modeled wetland. This is what we would see as a wetland so these are the methane emissions associated with the wetland. So the joules is putting essentially the wetland here. If we sample with swamps, and there's a bit of rescaling, we can see how wet charts compares, and this is a flux inversion. So the Sud is probably more here. So this is where the wetland is, but it's not well described. So there's an issue with joules as to why it's putting the wetland more in Ethiopia rather than South Sudan. So we can then look at this in terms of the wetland actual wetland fractions. I've done these slightly the wrong way around, but this is the way the figures were presented. So we have the wetland, so we can see the emissions do largely follow where the wetland is. This is some MODIS imagery to look at where the darker areas tend to indicate water. And this is where the kind of microwave product, so this is more where the soot wetland is. And I'm going to come on to this later in the talk about if we use a flood inundation model with joules, that we can actually we seem to get a better description. So this suggests that there's a missing process in the current in the joules wetland scheme that I've been describing so far. And to kind of bring that home, this is a Sentinel-5 image of the column methane over that in this area, and we can kind of see the very strong methane emissions associated with where there's. So we've got a challenge about trying to improve the description of wetlands in joules. And I kind of just repeat this very quickly with a second area, which is in southern Africa. So there's various swamps on the Zambezi. Down here we have the Okavango inland river delta, so we can see a lot of wetland areas in this region. And we can see where joules is putting the wetland and the associated methane. We see where what happens if we mask it. We can look at the wet charts emissions, and this is used as a prior for a geoschem inversion. So this is the posterior, where you can start to see that it's putting the methane where the observations are saying methane is and where the wetlands are. And again, we can look at a wetland data set here. And again, if we start to include an overbank inundation scheme with joules, that we start to get a better description. And similarly, we can then see the different methane hotspots. So you can clearly see the Okavango inland delta here, some of the other wetland systems. So we've looked at the key controls on methane. So overall, this configuration of joules gave comparable performance to the data-driven wet charts. The wetland methane cycle was typically underestimated by between 2 to 20 ppb. We get, so the correlation coefficient is reasonable to good. It's not brilliant, although there are several regions, as I've shown, that exhibit very poor correlations. So again, I've already alluded to this. So in terms of the specifics of that factorial study, there are significant difference between ensemble members. The vegetation configuration has a small effect. Temperature, the effect of temperature is moderate, with the lower Q10 values generally performing better. And neither choice of wetland extent tends to perform better than the other, but clearly both have deficiencies. And I think the main message that I've tried to show you there is that we need a fluvial or overbank river inundation in joules. I now want to slightly change tack and say how we would take this into how methane from wetlands and permafrost reduce the allowable carbon budgets. So this was work that was commissioned in the UK from a number of projects. We collaborated, although they've got different objectives. We came together because we were all using the Imogen climate emulator to investigate particular aspects, but we're also, using Imogen and joules. So Clifftop was to look at the climate feedbacks from wetlands and permafrost thaw. There was a land use based project, another one looking at anthropogenic methane mitigation. So this work was written up. There are a number of publications there, and this particular program was actually to make contributions into the IPCC special reports that were produced in 2018 and 2019. And then because we had collaborated and had worked off a common JULES Imogen framework, we were able to bring together these different studies and do a synthesis. And that was work that I led and published in 2021. So what we're doing is Imogen typically works in a forward sense, that you provide greenhouse gas concentrations over time. They are radiatively active, so they change the energy budget of the atmosphere. You change the temperature. There's drawdown of heat and carbon onto the land and oceans. So that's in a forward mode. But what we were interested here was to actually say what would happen if we were to actually aim for the Paris Agreement targets of 2 degrees of warming or 1.5 degrees of warming, rather than trying to run the model forward and try and identify a scenario that is kind of close to that thing. So as part of a paper that was published in 2017, we developed some parameterizations to represent this temperature change, and then created an inverse version of the Imogen climate emulator. So this is what I was talking about in forward mode. So you'd start from some prescribed emissions, affects the composition through the radiative forcing. It changes the energy balance. That's going to change the temperature. And then you can use that temperature change with pattern scaling to emulate other climate models. And we can then bring that in with the JULES and use that to drive the JULES model. In the inverse model, we're obviously talking from a temperature change. We go through the energy balance model to say, what does that mean for atmospheric composition? And out of that, we can then say something about the anthropogenic emissions, particularly of carbon. So this is the modeling system. We've got an inverse form of Imogen. We bring together these separate developments around wetlands, permafrost thaw, and land use. Imogen has a relatively simple treatment of atmospheric chemistry, but it allows for the formation of ozone from methane. And we've got an ocean heat and a carbon uptake. And at the time of this work, Imogen was emulating 34 climate and Earth system models participating in CMIP5. So that gives us 34 different realizations of the future climate. And we can use that as a measure of the of climate uncertainty. So as I say, we're starting from a common baseline configuration. We did work where we're looking at not only attaining 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees of warming, but we looked at an overshoot, which goes up to about 1.75 degrees and comes down to reach 1.5 by 2100. So project specific clifftop, we're looking at permafrost, soil carbon, wetlands, and wetland methane. The land use project is looking at bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, afforestation and reforestation. So it's looking at taking different scenarios about where bioenergy crops would go. And the methane, anthropogenic methane mitigation one was looking at idealized scenarios of future methane and how that would, through the ozone, through both the direct impacts of methane on the kind of radiative balance, but also indirect effects of methane on the carbon cycle through vegetation ozone damage. We change through the damage to vegetation, it changes the carbon uptake. So we're bringing together those separate projects. So focusing on ours, we want, so what you see here are some models, and you kind of see in the solid lines, the median of the 34 member ensemble. So this is for 1.5 degrees in the blue. The orange is for the overshoot scenario, and the red is for the 2 degrees. And the different the shaded colors represent the different ensemble members. So we can look at the change in the permafrost in terms of permafrost area, permafrost extent for these different runs, and you can see the time evolution. So we're comparing in the maps observations, looking at the green is the kind of maximum permafrost extent, the red is the minimum, and the gray is where the model is saying that there's permafrost. Again, max and min extent. And then these are some other data sets that have been put together where we're comparing against some observational or model other permafrost. This is a model into comparison. So we feel that we've got a reasonable description here, not perfect, but it's obviously says it's reasonable. And so we can then look at that and see the change in permafrost area, both at the 1 meter and 3 meters. We can look at the permafrost carbon that's entering the active carbon cycle. So we can use diagnostic that tell us about carbon still in the permafrost or whether the carbon is being lost to the atmosphere. And what I should say is that there's some ongoing effects beyond. We were looking this out to 2100, but some of those permafrost effects are not fully realized at 2100. So that gives it on the permafrost. So what we can then do is look at this in terms of what it means in terms of the carbon budgets. So what we look at is the change in the carbon stores. And if you just hold for a moment, I'll come back to this because I've got a plot that probably makes this a bit clear. So we look at how the carbon is changed in the different components of the land, the atmosphere, the ocean. And as we do these runs, we can look at the changes in those carbon stores. And we say that those changes then will have reflect things that we can do in terms of the carbon budgets. So what we're showing here is in red is the standard without the permafrost and wetland methane feedbacks on. We switch on one of those feedbacks, the permafrost feedback. We switch on the second wetland, separately we do a wetland methane feedback, and then we do both combined. And what we find is that if we take account of these feedbacks, we're actually going to reduce the anthropogenic carbon budget by about 12%. So taking account of these climate land, natural land feedbacks is actually going to constrain the carbon budgets that we have remaining. Just to jump to this synthesis, we set up a control run. We do a mitigation run. This is for methane, and then we do various. So we've got 2 runs there, and we're using the methane from with the wetlands and permafrost thaw from Jules switched on. So we're more interested in what anthropogenic methane mitigation might do. So we've got a scenario, a control scenario, and a methane mitigation scenario. Similar, we have some land use scenarios where we have a control run. We look at a scenario where there's large-scale deployment of bioenergy crops. So it's particularly on land that's not needed for food production. So there's a food first policy. And then what we've done is we've developed an alternative scenario where we say, what if the land given over to the bioenergy crops reverts to its natural state? And some of that, so I just show some of the regions. Canada, we can see changes here in terms of impact of the bioenergy crop scenario. So we can look at it for different land cover types, trees, agriculture, the bioenergy, grasses. So what you see for Canada is that you're actually removing trees in this bioenergy scenario. You're cutting, the boreal forests. Whereas for others, you might be actually making changes that are mostly on land that's currently assigned to agriculture that isn't needed for agriculture in future, or for other land surface components. So we're kind of particularly keen to see what happens with trees. So we've set up a number of runs where we looked at a control run, we looked at the methane mitigation by itself, we looked at the bioenergy scenario, we looked at a natural, and then we brought together these two. So we've got these imposed temperature changes. We can look at what it means for methane. We've done scenario runs, so we're running this as a 136 member ensemble. With different runs for 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. And then you can look at how this changes for methane, BECCS versus with methane. And so we can look at these different scenarios, and we can see how the methane concentration changes. And you can obviously see that you've got two families there, because you've got with anthropogenic methane control, you're reducing the atmospheric concentration of methane. You can then look also at the impact on the carbon dioxide, where obviously you start to see how the land influences, the land carbon cycle is going to influence the carbon uptake and therefore the carbon dioxide emissions. So unfortunately, I did put these slides slightly out of order, but in terms of the anthropogenic fossil, this is the allowable carbon budget. We define that as a change in the different components. And then we can see how those different components change for the different scenarios. So essentially the circles represent the ensemble member, and the line is the median. So this is for the different components. So and then the purple, the box and whispers, is where you've combined all those sources together. So what we've also then done is to do an optimization, which is to select in a post-processing step, is it better to have bioenergy crops with carbon capture or storage, or is it or natural, i.e. afforestation, reforestation, to maximize the carbon uptake? So that's what we've done there. So we can look at these different things, different components, and then try and tease out. And what we find is generally that obviously methane mitigation is very positive. The land-based mitigation is more nuanced, and there are various kind of complexities there, not least is about, in this version of Jules, about how productive the bioenergy crop is. So it was slightly less productive, and so we've introduced a kind of scale factor. And that choice of scale factor then influences whether the whether afforestation or bioenergy crops is the preferred option. And this is on a global basis, and then you can start to see. So you can look at, use the model systems here to see which is the preferable from the carbon uptake point of view. So again, this is by subcontinental regions. We can look at the contribution of different components. Again, if we increase this scaling factor, we promote bioenergy crops. So that's why you see bioenergy starts to become more important. So this is the carbon taken up by the bioenergy crops. And then you can start to see that we're starting to trade off in here, say for Western Europe, where bioenergy is being done on areas that were, would have been forested, but have been converted into bioenergy crops. Similarly, Canada, particularly, and Russia. So we can present that as a map, and what we see is that generally methane mitigation is very positive. but there is, as I said earlier, a much more nuanced picture for the land-based mitigation. So in summary then, the natural carbon and methane sinks are important. So they reduce the carbon budgets and they become more important as we go for the lower stabilization temperature. Methane mitigation versus land-based. So methane is giving equivalent to 188 per this of the anthropogenic CO2, and it's beneficial for all regions, especially the major emitting regions. Land-based mitigation is more nuanced. For boreal forests, its preferences for avoided deforestation. For tropical forests, afforestation and avoided deforestation have significant potential. And basically, growing bioenergy crops is only really preferable where it exists, where it replaces existing agricultural land, with the proviso that there's no impact on food security, food production. In my final section, I want to talk about current developments to JEWELS. So improvements to modeling wetland areas. So this would be, and I'm grateful to various people here that I'll acknowledge towards at the end. So this is from Nick Gedney. So if you recall, there was quite a big blob of methane over the Amazon. So this is really tied to the wetland fraction. And just a simple change in recognizing the tropical soils and the fact that they're heavily denatured, so they lose a lot of the cations. So what would be oxazoles and similar that are considered to be clays are actually more like sands. And so actually, if you change the soil hydraulic properties of these tropical soils, you actually see quite a significant improvement in the JEWELS wetland fraction. And it starts to look slightly more consistent with some of the more high resolution observational products that have been developed over the Amazon. So that's one aspect, is about a better description of the soil properties. I've mentioned already earlier in the Parker et al. 2022 work that we need to include inundation. So JEWELS at the moment, in a sense, has what we would call surface water flooding or pluvial. It comes from the rain. So heavy or persistent precipitation events may cause surface water flooding. What we know is as that water moves away, that high river flows may exceed the channel capacity downstream, and the water overflows the riverbanks, and you get so-called overbank inundation. So there's work going on at the moment to develop, to look at this inundation, and in two senses: driving a flood inundation model called CAMAFlood with JEWELS outputs. A paper was published by my colleague Toby Matthews last year, showing some initial work in that direction, and then starting to integrate relevant elements of CAMAFlood into JEWELS. So that's really to go back to the imagery I showed you before. So where you start to allow for inundation, you're getting a better description of where the wetlands are and their extent. Some work from my colleague of Sonja Folwell, who's kind of been really looking at this and developing JEWELS with CAMAFlood for the Sud wetland. So particularly because there's a lot of interannual variability. So typically the area, this is the Sud, is between 5 to 10,000 square kilometers. But in 2019, 2020, significant rains upstream gave rise to an extensive area of flooding over 50,000 square kilometers. So capturing the interannual variability in flood extent is important for understanding methane. So one of the things I haven't got data, but is what is showing is that there's a lot of some of the recent increases in atmospheric methane are associated with African wetlands. So we started to build in the JEWELS CAMAFlood simulations, and improving the interannual variability of the inundation extent by really incorporating what is happening in Lake Victoria, both in terms of water levels, and there's a link here in terms of teleconnections to the Indian Ocean dipole, but also to some extent some of the management and how the water flows down the Nile to the Sud wetland. And you can see here from a plot that Sandra's given me, looking at modeled river flows at this yellow point, just down on the Nile, but downstream from Lake Victoria, but before the Sud wetland. If you take a control run where you don't take account of Lake Victoria's behavior, you see little interannual variability. You can see different little variability, but if you take account of what's happening in Lake Victoria by forcing, you can actually start to get a better description of the flows. And if we get the flows right, then we'll also start to improve on the wetlands. And this can also, and another aspect of this is the way the model works in detail. It's about the branching of the river system through the wetland, and Sandra's been working quite hard on there in terms of introducing bifurcations. So that's work that Sandra's in, and I think it's currently being written up, but very important in making connections, in a sense, large-scale connections here, but more importantly about wetlands and methane. Nick Gedney has also done work around methane from flooded trees, if you recall. So one of the conventional ways of methane release is through the plant Arencoma, but other work has shown that trees, particularly those that are wet adapted, have other routes of lenticles for taking oxygen in. Those act as, so the trees can act as chimneys for methane release. And there's experimental work that did studies to look at these fluxes from a whole range of trees and came up with large emission estimates from Amazon floodplains. And in its subsequent work, there was also further work to look at trees and non-flooded wetlands. So Nick has kind of looked at the data and has developed a simple scheme that's related to water table to look at how the methane emissions from trees might vary with water table, and has come up with these parameterizations, which she's put into a version of Jules. And from that, she can then look at the contribution of these different sources into the Amazon methane budget. So we see that these non-inundated areas contribute about 3 teragrams per year. The trees provide about 16, and then there's a kind of the other wetland contribution, and you see it's this 22. This tree contribution is obviously significant in terms of this natural methane wetland source. We've also, I've kind of said at the beginning about the isotopes here. Jules doesn't have methane isotopes per se, but we've essentially taken some Jules outputs. But here we see that different wetland systems, and in fact, actually different methane sources have different isotope signatures for carbon-13 and also for the deuterated methane. So these are carbon-13. So we see that different types of boreal wetland systems, whether be it bogs or fens, have different wetland signatures. So we did some work where we effectively took the wetlands, the general wetland map, and then tried to classify it as a bog or fen. And we did that by effectively noting that bogs tend to be acidic, and we were using pH as a discriminator. We're using data taken from a synthesis study of methane flux measurements analysis, where they've looked at the temperature dependencies for different wetland systems, whether it's bogs, rich fen, or poor fens, and then taken that together to produce not only a methane flux for these different things, but also what was the source signature would be. So we could then produce a modeled methane source signature. So this is for a range of wetland systems, not only in the boreal, Alaska, northern high latitude northern hemisphere, but also tropical sites. So what I would say we've done for tropical is we've really just discriminated by C3 or C4 grass. But what is really reassuring there is how we're starting to get some of that differentiation in the wetland isotope signatures, and we can produce that and put it into a map. So we're combining the wetland distribution and assigning different methane isotope signatures there. And these can then be used in chemical transport models to compare with atmospheric measurements, or could be used in inverse atmospheric chemistry transport models to help constrain the methane sources and sinks. To kind of improve the behavior of methane, particularly at high latitudes, my colleague Sarah Chadburn introduced a microbe scheme into JAWS. It's a very simple model of methanogenic growth and dormancy. And what she found there is by putting in JAWS microbes, so comparing the blue trace with the purple, she actually got a much better description of the methane flux measurements over the course of a year at some high latitude, mostly high latitude methane sites. So that's work that's in part of JAWS. And probably where we're kind of moving to now, and I'm getting towards the end of my talk, is we're looking at peatlands in JAWS. So peatlands contain 30% of the global soil carbon. It's an important carbon sink in terms of uptake. But what we know is that degraded peatlands, or peatlands that have been converted to other uses like agriculture, actually emit greenhouse gases and contribute about 5% of the kind of global emissions. So there's various work within the JAWS community in the UK about looking at tropical peatlands, about trying to accumulate carbon and trying to grow peatlands in JAWS, and also the methane from those peatlands. And work that's just started in the last year or so has got more of a focus on temperate and high latitude peatlands in terms of soil hydrology, work to do in terms of getting the hydrology of peatlands right, and that means soil, how to represent hydrology in peatlands, trying to get the soil carbon, trying to do things around vegetation that is specific to peatlands, as much that the vegetation creates the peatlands, so the different types of peatland vegetation and how that might link with the nitrogen cycle. So that's where we are. This is all relevant and it's work that's in play at the moment. So I think that's my final slide, but I just round up now with some acknowledgements and thanks. So it's both to acknowledge funding sources, UKRI and various projects, but I would also acknowledge the large number of my contributors, co-authors, collaborators, and people who provided material for this presentation. So I say a big thank you to them all, and look forward to continuing this work. And I just really conclude with a list of relevant publications. So I'll stop there. Thank you.